Today, I'm going to show you 3 deadly sequences from a brutal gambit I learned after years of losing to the French defense, including one killer maneuver in the advanced variation that 99% of players just flat out ignore, even though it's just sitting there in the open. So yeah, no messing around, I'm Philip, let's jump right in. E4, E6, D4, and D5. That's the classic French defense setup. In this position, the most typical move is knight to c3, just reinforcing the center and getting ready for natural piece development. But in online games, it's super common to see white go pawn to e5, stepping right into the advanced variation. And by pushing that pawn to e5, white grabs a lot of space in the center and cuts down black's options for a while. Now the thing is, that move locks in the pawn structure really early, which leads to some key strategic consequences. One of the first things you'll notice is that the black knight can't go to f6 anymore, and the bishop no longer has access to d6, which would normally be a natural square in many other openings. So that's why black has to look for other ways to develop. One typical plan is to go knight to h6 and then f5, trying to put some pressure on the center. But that path comes with a risk. If the knight really goes to h6, white can just take it and mess up black's pawn structure. Now, at first glance, this seems like one of those openings where the side with more space just ends up better by default. And honestly, that kind of thinking made me lose a ton of games against the French. Up until the day I realized there are 3 super specific signs that completely flip how you evaluate this position. And here's the thing, there's this one natural move that pretty much every player makes. It feels logical, active, even elegant. But in practice, it gets you into an almost lost position before you even know what's happening. I'm going to show you what that move is and why it tricks so many players. But first, it's key to understand the structure that makes the trap work. Those advanced pawns that look powerful and dominant, they're actually hiding the kind of weaknesses that tend to decide the whole game. And if you don't spot those signs in time, you're going to fall into the same trap I did, again and again, for years. So the most common move for black here is pawn to c5, directly challenging the center. And in this position, the right move for white is to reinforce the pawn chain with pawn to c3, not to capture. Taking on c5 would isolate your pawns and weaken your position. That capture, even though it looks tempting, usually favors black. They become more active, get a lead in development, and start attacking the isolated pawn on e5. So the best path is to keep the structure solid with c3. Black keeps up the pressure with knight to c6, targeting the pawn on d4. White responds naturally with knight to f3, reinforcing the center and defending that same pawn. And now black goes for the well-known Paulson attack, playing queen to b6. This is a typical French defense move. It increases the pressure on d4 and also messes with white's queenside development. After all, the bishop on c1 can't develop freely because the pawn on b2 would be left hanging. The most logical reaction for white is to play pawn to a3, preparing the push with b4 and later on a bishop fianchetto. Another solid option here is simply bishop at d3, developing in a stable way and keeping the structure solid. There's a well-known trap in this variation, and it's worth understanding it in depth. The idea is simple. When white plays bishop to d3, they stop directly defending the pawn on d4, since the queen, which was providing support, no longer is. On the surface, it looks like the pawn is just hanging, and that's exactly where the trap begins. If the player with the black pieces falls for the bait and captures the pawn, the punishment comes fast. After knight takes on d4, knight takes on d4, and queen takes on b4, white goes bishop to b5 check, and when the opponent blocks the check, the black queen ends up falling. And you can even improve the sequence by grabbing the bishop with check before taking the queen, winning even more material, and without leaving your bishop hanging at the end. But over time, especially among players rated between 1100 and 1300, this trap starts to lose its punch, because opponents learn to sidestep this line with bishop to d7 after bishop to d3. And that's when a lot of people give up on this variation, thinking it only worked because of the trick. And now you've got to move the bishop back to defend the pawn again, which is at least what most people think. And by the way, if you play as black and want to know exactly how to avoid these traps and shut down the white attack, I've got a full video on the French defense, and I'll leave the link in the description. But coming back to our side, playing as white, this is exactly where most people give up on this line. But that's actually the biggest mistake you can make, because when your opponent avoids the obvious trap, they tend to let their guard down, and that's when a much stronger idea kicks in. I'm going to show you the sacrifice that turns this position into a nightmare for your opponent. But there's one critical detail, because you need to understand why they think they're winning, when in fact it's a conceptual mistake. Even without the trap, the position is still very promising for white, because instead of pulling the bishop back to defend the pawn, the right move is to castle and intentionally allow the capture on d4. And that's where the Milner-Barry Gambit comes in, which is a surprisingly strong weapon. Unlike most gambits where the sacrifice is obvious, this one is disguised because it looks like white just forgot about the pawn. Black captures, knight takes on d4, then knight takes on d4, and finally queen takes on d4. Now the bishop check with bishop to b5 is no longer available because bishop to d7 already shuts down that tactic. At this point, the player with the black pieces is usually feeling good, thinking they've secured an early material advantage, thinking, I got a free pawn, now I just need to trade pieces and head to the endgame, they think. But then comes the strategic blow, knight to c3. At first glance, it looks like white has left another pawn undefended, and the opponent, a bit greedy, thinks they're increasing their advantage. But it's actually the opposite. While the play with the black pieces waits precious time moving the queen around, white is developing all their pieces quickly and harmoniously. That imbalance in development is the real poison behind the gambit. Black might be up material, but they're way behind in coordination, and in the opening, that's almost always fatal. We've reached a position where white has full initiative, because after playing rook to e1, the rook lines up directly with the enemy king on the semi-open file, adding pressure to the center, and castling is already done, the king is safe, and nearly all of white's minor pieces are developed, while meanwhile the player with the black pieces has only managed to get one bishop into the game so far. Now, if the opponent finds the most precise move, queen to b8, a classic engine-style resource, they can still put up some resistance. Even so, white starts to recover some of the material, using the pin and grabbing pawns back. But let's be honest, very few players actually find that move over the board. What happens far more often is queen to c7, the second most common move. And that's exactly where white's advantage starts to grow quickly, because after capturing the pawn with tempo against the queen, the opponent is left with basically two defensive options, and one of them leads to an absolutely brilliant endgame. Let me show you the more natural move first, queen to d6, so you can get a feel for the pattern. But remember this, when the opponent goes queen to c6, that's when things get beautiful. It's an endgame you're definitely going to want to see. So let's start with queen to d6. The idea is to keep an eye on the fork again, while also threatening to take your knight. Bishop to c4 defends the knight twice. Now the knight is protected by the bishop, it's protected by the queen, and you're also setting up some potential discovered attacks. Some ideas involving the queen, which isn't hanging right now, but it's something interesting to keep in mind for later. Next, black usually develops with bishop to e7, trying to finish development. But here comes a simple and devastating move, bishop to f4. You develop with tempo, hit the queen, and at the same time you're setting up knight to c7, a fork that hits both the king and the rook. Everything flows in a very logical and natural way. After queen to c5 comes knight to c7, and white is already pretty much winning. It's a clean, direct attack, and basically unstoppable. Now let's look at what I promised with queen to c6. There's a really beautiful finish here. It starts with bishop to b5, and you just keep pushing forward, attacking in the most brutal way possible. So what's wrong with black capturing one of your minor pieces? Well, if the queen takes on d5, we already know that pawn is pinned, so you can just take the queen, and it's game over. So that line doesn't work for black. And what if the queen takes the bishop instead? Well, then you've got knight to c7, a triple fork that also picks up the queen on the next move. But there's another version that's even more brutal. After we attack the queen, if it goes back to c7, that's a serious mistake because we've got another attacking move and we win the pawn. So, if the opponent spots that, they might try to defend the pawn by going queen to d4, keeping the queen active and protected. But then comes the most spectacular sacrifice in the gambit. Rook takes on e6. That's right, you're sacrificing the rook. And here, very few players have the tactical vision to spot a move like this. So what's the trick? No matter how black captures, they walk right into a deadly discovered check. If the bishop takes on e6, you go bishop to b5, giving check. The king moves, and you take the queen. If instead of taking with the bishop, your opponent takes with the pawn, it's the same idea, but on the other side. Bishop to g6, check on the king, and you win the queen. In both cases, you're trading a rook for a queen, which is a fantastic deal. So after you play rook a1, let's take a look at black's main move here, which is queen to d6. It keeps defending the pawn on d5 and also puts the queen on a safer square. But even then, we're still gaining tempo by attacking, because now that we can't go for knight takes on d5, there's a really interesting move. Knight to b5. That puts pressure on the queen again, threatens the fork, and offers your knight up for a trade. And honestly, your opponent will probably take it because they're ahead in material and you're going all in on the attack. So trading knights feels pretty tempting. But this is where the magic really kicks in. If they take the knight, you recapture with check, and believe it or not, they've already lost castling rights. And once you see that for yourself, you're never going to look at this position the same way again. In this line, your opponent's going to have to keep the king in the center, so king to d8 is really the only move that makes sense. It steps out of the pin from the rook and also gets out of check without giving up more material. But if your opponent doesn't take your knight after you go knight to b5, you've still got a lot of play because they'll have to move the queen again. That means you're attacking with tempo on the queen. And the most natural move to keep an eye on the fork square here is queen to b6. Most players overlook this, but it actually makes all the difference in the game, because once again, you're developing with tempo on the opponent's queen. You bring your bishop out to e3, hit the queen, and now you can really see one of the key patterns in this gambit. Your opponent's going to end up dancing around with their queen a lot, and they're probably not going to take that pawn on d4 the next time they play the French. And if they go for a bishop to c5 here, which looks like a decent move, you can take their bishop, force them to recapture with the queen, and then grab the open file with tempo on the queen again. At that point, there's no stopping the fork anymore, because your opponent's going to have to move the queen back. And knight to c7 already wins the game. This is exactly the kind of thing that can completely flip the result of a game. Now we're getting into one of the trickier lines. When your opponent knows the position well, instead of grabbing the pawn and risking getting exposed, they'll usually go pawn to a6, a more solid preventative move. That move makes a lot of sense. In a bunch of similar positions, either the knight or the bishop jumps to b5 and becomes a real headache for black. So by pushing pawn to a6, the black player shuts down that annoyance in advance. So what should you do here as white? At this point, there's no need to go all in on sacrificing a second pawn. The best move is just to strengthen a position with queen to e2. That way, you keep your structure solid and stay flexible for development. Normally, black continues with knight to e7, getting ready to bring the knight out and reinforce the center. I, on the other hand, like to tuck the king away on h1. It's a solid prophylactic move that clears the kingside pawns and leaves the option to push pawn to f4 when the time is right. After that, the black knight comes to c6, gaining space and increasing pressure on the central pawn. And while it's possible to defend it by pushing pawn to f4, here I'd rather prioritize development and attacking potential. That's why I like to go with bishop to e3. This move sets up a direct attack and improves piece coordination, creating some really interesting chances for active play. From there, the opponent's queen might be forced to reposition and take the pawn on e5, and you still gain valuable tempo by pushing pawn to f4, attacking the queen. When it steps back, that's your cue to go f5, and this is where the most dangerous moment of the entire game kicks in. It may look like black finally found some compensation, but this is exactly when white's attack becomes unstoppable. I want to show you a sequence of sacrifices that leads to a forced mate. But first, take a look at this, and black can't move the pawn on e6. Capturing here will be a big mistake. That pawn is a key part of the defense, and if it gets pushed, it completely weakens the center. Black needs to develop carefully before thinking about any kind of counterattack. After you push pawn to f5, it's kind of for the opponent to go bishop to e7, trying to solve their development issues and get ready to castle. And right here, there's a really strong move. Rook d1. That move lines your rook up with the enemy queen and opens the door for some really promising tactical ideas. And here's the thing, the move that looks the most natural and safest for black, kingside castling, is actually a huge mistake. The opponent's thinking is usually, I'm gonna castle and get my king to safety. But that's exactly where it all falls apart. With f6, you crack open the king side and launch a direct attack on the king. The white pieces are already working together and black's left with pretty much no defense. If the bishop takes on f6, that's your moment to take the initiative. No reason to back down, the whole idea is to blow the position wide open. So we go rook takes on f6 and the sacrifices don't stop there. If the pawn captures the rook, you just keep giving out material. We follow up with bishop takes on h7 check, the king takes, and that's when the final blow hits. Queen to h5 check. The attack is in full swing, the king's wide open, and white brings everything into the fight. The white attack comes together so naturally here. Every move carries a real threat and the black king starts running out of safe places to go. And notice, he can never find shelter on g7 because that square is covered by both the queen and the white bishop. In a position like this, even a simple move like bishop to h6 brings that bishop into the attack and just completely collapses black's setup. So the most natural thing for the opponent to do is drop the king back to g8, and that's exactly when a strong move hits. Knight to e4. That brings another piece into the attack and takes full advantage of the fact that the black pawn on d5 is pinned by the rook on d1, so we can't move, which just makes the king even more exposed. It's a deep idea, but once you spot the pattern, it just makes sense. All your pieces are in the attack and working together. After knight to e4, you're putting pressure on both the enemy queen and the pawn on f6 at the same time. The most natural move for black would be queen to e5, looking to ease some of that pressure. But even then, the white attack just keeps coming. You can bring your queen in with tempo, starting with queen to g4 check. The king has to move, and then comes queen to h4, another check. The whole sequence is simple but incredibly efficient. You force the king to walk along the king side, and in the process, the defenses get even weaker. When the king drops back to g8, your queen and knight already cover the critical squares, and that's when you take the pawn with check, the king's forced right back to g7, and that's where the inevitable finish comes in, queen to h6, checkmate. It's a long sequence, yeah, but it's totally logical. White keeps delivering check after check, building up more and more pressure while black is stuck with no real defensive options. And the thing is, finding the attacking moves here is way easier than figuring out the defensive ones. And that's what makes this position so powerful. Look, now you know 3 deadly lines that curse the French defense. But here's the thing, when your opponent plays e4, guess what? You're going to have to pick a response. And if you don't know how to play the French defense, then congratulations, you just learned exactly how to get crushed. That's why you've got to click the video that's popping up on your screen right now, because in that one, I show you exactly how to play the French, how to turn defense into attack, and how to avoid all those traps you just saw, including a brilliant way to punish the Milner-Barry. So click it now, because if you don't know the black side too, it's like you're playing with one hand tied behind your back, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.